Beneath the dust of sealed archives and the weight of locked vaults lies a darkness history has never fully confessed. Under the file heading 5 Disturbingly Forbidden, Reichsbank. Reports that expose dark secrets. We uncover not mere records of war, but revelations once deemed too poisonous for public sight. These are not battlefield victories, nor patriotic legends repeated in classrooms. These are the erased footnotes, the censored cables, the stamped pages marked top secret, and buried beneath layers of diplomatic necessity. What we hold here are documents that speak of human beings treated not as lives, but as data points in experiments, as pawns in financial bargains, as collateral in alliances forged at gunpoint. From the chilling silence of medical trials in Dachau to the economic pacts negotiated in neutral Swiss rooms, from the unspeakable atrocities of Unit 731 to the betrayal of refugees under Operation Keelhaul, and finally to the erased truth of the Katyn massacre, each file whispers what leaders swore never to admit. These were not accidents. They were choices, calculated and deliberate, made by men in power who believed secrecy was survival. Tonight, as these files are reopened, the voices of the erased return, and once heard, they cannot be silenced again. Chapter 1. Classified experiments beneath Dachau's shadows. The concrete walls of Dachau concealed more than a camp of confinement. They hid laboratories where war blurred into horror. Within these narrow rooms, light bulbs burned late into the night as doctors in black SS uniforms scribbled clinical notes, recording suffering as if it were scientific progress. The files labeled Geheim Reichssache, State Secret, reveal how the Luftwaffe collaborated with camp physicians in the pursuit of survival data. Their focus was hypothermia, a weaponless killer of soldiers stranded at sea or shot down over frozen territory. Between 1942 and 1943, a series of trials were conducted on Soviet prisoners of war, many captured on the Eastern Front, naked, immersed in ice water, or left exposed to Bavarian winter winds. Each subject became a live chart of human endurance. The reports describe heartbeat decline, muscular spasms, incoherent screams, until silence. American investigators uncovered fragments of this data in 1945. But hidden among those documents are memoranda showing exchanges with Allied medical observers even before the collapse of the Reich. Codenamed Paperclip, this quiet channel ensured that German science would not die with its empire. The chilling evidence suggests that even as the camps continued their industrialized killing, information was being earmarked for transfer. Notes, charts, experimental outcomes, all considered too valuable to destroy. The archive mentions Dr. Sigmund Rascher, infamous for his hypothermia experiments. In one declassified transcript, he describes immersing men in tanks filled with ice until their core temperature was below 28 degrees Celsius. Many died during the process. Others were subjected to brutal reheating attempts, including immersion in boiling water or forced copulation with camp prostitutes. The reports read not as testimonies of crimes, but as scientific procedure. Subject expired after cardiac failure. Duration, 53 minutes. Cold, clinical, inhuman. Yet what unsettles most is the correspondence that follows. In March 1945, a report bearing both US Army Medical Corps letterhead and a German signature references data acquired through Luftwaffe Dachau collaboration to be secured for aeromedical research. Classified for strategic research only, it reveals a moral compromise. Atrocities were not simply exposed, they were absorbed. Human suffering was translated into numbers, then recycled into Cold War survival manuals, shaping how pilots trained for crash landings and ocean survival. Testimonies at the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1947 referenced these experiments only indirectly. Prosecutors were urged to avoid mention of Allied interest in the data, fearing the exposure of complicity. Instead, attention centered on general Nazi brutality. Behind the courtroom doors, however, internal memos show debate. Should the evidence be destroyed, or should it be preserved under lock for national security? Preservation 1. Entire folders were transferred to US military archives, stamped not for release, and filed away for decades. The atmosphere within Dachau during these experiments remains chillingly vivid in survivor accounts. Guards forced prisoners to witness the freezing trials, ensuring that terror extended beyond the subjects themselves. The laboratory smelled of chemicals, damp wool and sweat. The crack of ice-filled tubs echoed down corridors, otherwise filled with the cries of the starving. Notes recovered from a guard's pocket describe blue lips, glassy eyes, silence after shaking ceased. To the Reich, these were not lives wasted. They were numbers gained. The broader question emerges: who knew and when? British archives hint that RAF researchers were aware of German hypothermia studies by 1944, intercepted. Communications from Munich described progress on cold survival techniques. Yet official policy remained silence. For the Allies, condemning the crimes openly while simultaneously utilizing the data risked exposure of hypocrisy. Thus, the record was split. Public denunciation of inhumanity, private integration of results. In 1950, Project Paperclip brought several of these German scientists to American soil. They walked through laboratories at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and presented findings to American doctors. References to Dachau vanished from the papers. Only the results remained. One memorandum lists over 400 data points on hypothermia endurance, without mentioning that each point equaled a dead prisoner. The sanitized version became part of Cold War readiness, feeding into training manuals for pilots flying missions over Korea. Even the Soviets, though they publicly denounced Nazi experiments, quietly sought access to the same findings. Captured German physicians were interrogated in Moscow, their knowledge filtered into Red Army manuals. Thus, the victims of Dachau served not one regime, but two, their agony fueling the rivalry that followed the war's official end. Walking through the preserved rooms of Dachau today, visitors see cold tiles and iron fixtures, but the files tell of another layer: the sound of bubbling ice water, the smell of damp wool, the scratch of pens on charts. Each mark was the erasure of a life, transformed into military knowledge. The darkness here is not just what was done, but what was preserved, protected, and carried forward into the modern era. The declassified files do not ask forgiveness. They demand recognition. For every number in those charts was a name, a face, a story erased. When Allied and Axis powers alike weighed the value of human suffering against the urgency of war, the decision was made in silence. And once made, it was buried, until these pages resurfaced. The shadows of Dachau remain, not only in stone and barbed wire, but in training manuals, medical protocols, and the hidden conscience of nations. The truth is clear: Dachau was not just a camp of death, but a laboratory where morality itself froze, shattering under the weight of survival at any cost. Chapter 2: Forbidden Pact of the Black Reichsbank. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin, the Reich collapsed in fire and rubble. Yet hidden away in meeting rooms across Zurich and Bern, men in dark suits and polished shoes conducted a quieter retreat. One not of soldiers, but of bankers. Within declassified OSS financial reports marked secret, not for release, investigators found proof of a forbidden pact. This was not surrender. It was preservation. Under the codename Operation Sunrise, high-ranking SS financial officers negotiated with Swiss bankers and intermediaries from neutral states, ensuring that stolen assets would not vanish with the Reich, but instead be reborn through international accounts. At the center stood the Black Reichsbank, the financial heart of Hitler's empire. Documents signed by Emil Pohl, the Reichsbank's vice president, revealed detailed transfers of looted gold, art, and currency into shadow companies and Swiss vaults. Each transaction was designed to erase blood from metal, transforming the wealth of victims into the seed capital of post-war fortunes. The files show that much of this gold bore markings impossible to mistake. Many ingots, stamped with Reich eagles, carried chemical traces linking them to melted dental fillings extracted from camp victims. A ledger titled Sonderkonto SS, discovered in Zurich, itemized shipments from Auschwitz and Treblinka by weight and value. One chilling note read simply: dental gold, 1,232 kilograms, delivery secure. These shipments moved through Swiss banks with discreet efficiency, hidden behind false names and layers of numbered accounts. The neutrality of Switzerland, praised during the war, now reads as a cloak under which atrocity was converted into currency. OSS officers documented these exchanges in painstaking detail. Yet the most disturbing discovery was not the laundering itself, but the involvement of international banks that would later fund European reconstruction. Declassified memos list American, British, and even Scandinavian institutions as indirect recipients of Reichsbank transfers. Though not all were complicit knowingly, the line between willful blindness and cooperation remains blurred. In one intercepted cable from 1944, a Swiss banker assured German officials, funds secure, transfer untraceable, future intact. The future he referenced was not Germany's war effort, it was the survival of Nazi wealth beyond defeat. The Allied public was told the war ended in unconditional surrender. Yet these documents reveal conditional survival for a chosen few. High-ranking SS members and financial officers secured passage to South America, their escapes financed by the very gold buried in Swiss vaults. Buenos Aires, Santiago, and São Paulo became havens for men whose names should have ended at Nuremberg. Instead, they appeared on corporate boards, agricultural estates, and shipping companies funded by the Black Reichsbank's ghost accounts. Operation Odessa, the infamous SS escape network, drew life from these very financial reserves. The wealth stolen from Europe's dead did not vanish. It grew, investing in ships, properties, and businesses across the Atlantic. The most damning piece of evidence appears in a memorandum from May 1945, signed by an OSS officer in Bern. It reads, "Conclusive evidence of Reichsbank transfers to Swiss and Argentine intermediaries. Recommendation: suppress for diplomatic purposes. Here lies the forbidden pact, not merely between German bankers and Swiss financiers, but between victorious allies and the silence they chose to maintain. For to expose the truth would have implicated not just defeated Nazis, but also the post-war financial systems the Allies needed to rebuild Europe and stabilize the Cold War order." One chilling detail lies in the records of the Bank for International Settlements, based in Basel. Created before the war to handle reparations, the BIS became a discreet channel for Reich assets even as Allied soldiers fought on the beaches of Normandy. Minutes from a meeting in 1944, now declassified, show representatives from multiple nations debating whether to expel Germany. Instead, transactions continued, under the reasoning that stability of international banking outweighed wartime morality. When Berlin burned, Basel's ledgers remained intact. Eyewitness testimonies gathered by OSS officers describe meetings in Zurich hotels where SS officers, stripped of uniforms and dressed as businessmen, signed agreements guaranteeing their survival. One source recounts a dimly lit conference room where Emil Pohl shook hands with a Swiss intermediary and stated, "The Reich may fall, but capital endures." His words, carefully recorded, echo across decades. For he was right, capital endured, and with it, the silent legacy of betrayal. Nuremberg prosecutors were aware of portions of this network, but key evidence was withheld. Documents were sealed, labeled sensitive to Allied economic interests. Instead, the trials focused on visible crimes, mass executions, forced labor, medical atrocities. Finance was too dangerous, for it reached into boardrooms and institutions that still held power. Entire chains of command slipped through the cracks, reinventing themselves as entrepreneurs in South America. Others re-emerged in West Germany, cloaked as respectable bankers, contributing to the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle. What went unspoken was the miracle's seed money, drawn from the veins of victims. The files paint a picture of survival, not through loyalty to ideology, but through the universality of money. Gold and currency crossed borders more easily than soldiers, slipping into neutral vaults where war could not touch them. This survival was purchased in shadows, traded in whispered deals across mahogany tables. It is a truth that undermines the myth of total defeat. For while Hitler's empire crumbled, its wealth did not. It merely changed names, accounts, and locations. Walking through these documents today, one cannot ignore the ink stains, the signatures, the official seals. They are not rumors, but contracts. They prove that the war did not simply end, it shifted form. Death camps became numbers, numbers became gold, gold became companies, and companies became the invisible skeleton of post-war economies. The Black Reichsbank did not fall into ruins. It dissolved into the bloodstream of global finance. The disturbing reality revealed in these archives is that justice was partial. The gallows claimed some, but the ledger preserved others. The silence was not ignorance, it was choice. For nations desperate to rebuild, exposing the true flow of Nazi wealth risked destabilizing the very structures they hoped to strengthen. Thus, the pact was made, to bury the evidence, to let capital cleanse its origins, to pretend that money was neutral. Yet within these sealed pages, neutrality dies. Each number, each shipment, each ingot of gold whispers otherwise. Behind the myth of liberation lies a darker truth. The war ended, but its profits lived on. Chapter 3. Disturbing Silence of Unit 731. Atrocities. Hidden deep in Tokyo's post-war interrogation archives, stamped with thick red ink that reads, "Confidential, not for release," lie the transcripts that expose one of the most disturbing silences of World War II. These documents concern Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army's covert biological warfare program, officially known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. The unit operated under a mask of sanitation and research. In reality, it was a laboratory of death. From its headquarters in Harbin, Manchuria, Unit 731 transformed entire villages into experimental grounds. Thousands of men, women, and children were not prisoners in the usual sense. They were specimens. They were referred to as logs, stripped of their humanity by order of General Shiro Ishii, the program's brilliant and monstrous commander. The archive files describe experiments that push the imagination into horror. Frostbite tests, plague-infected fleas, vivisections conducted without anesthesia, and deliberate infection with cholera, anthrax, and bubonic plague. Each operation was documented with meticulous precision, as though the suffering of thousands were merely scientific statistics to be catalogued and filed. The declassified transcripts reveal conversations between captured Unit 731 officers and American interrogators in late 1945. One colonel, whose name remains redacted in the surviving documents, calmly described frostbite experiments in which prisoners' limbs were frozen solid in Manchuria's sub-zero temperatures. Guards would strike the frozen flesh with sticks, waiting for the sound to resemble wood striking glass, an indication the tissue was entirely frozen. Victims were then thawed, not for rescue, but to observe the stages of gangrene and necrosis. Another section details the release of plague-carrying fleas into Chinese villages. Within days, entire communities succumbed to fever, boils, and death. One Japanese scientist noted in his report, "Effectiveness satisfactory. Spread reached projected targets within 72 hours. It is the language of logistics, not medicine." What makes these documents even more unsettling is the discovery of secret agreements struck after Japan's surrender. A confidential memorandum from General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters, dated 1947, states plainly, "Data from Japanese biological warfare research is to be secured. Prosecution of personnel not advised." In other words, the leaders of Unit 731 were not punished, they were recruited. The very scientists who had orchestrated mass human suffering were spared trials in exchange for their data, their experiments deemed too valuable to discard. Files show that Ishii himself was granted immunity, eventually living in quiet obscurity until his death in 1959, untouched by the justice that claimed so many others in Nuremberg or Tokyo. The reasoning behind this immunity was cold calculation. At the dawn of the Cold War, the United States sought to outpace the Soviet Union in every conceivable field of warfare, including biological weapons. Intelligence summaries marked eyes only confirmed that American officials feared Moscow would seize Japanese scientists first. Thus a deal was struck, silence for science. The victims of Unit 731 were erased from official records, their deaths converted into data points for military advantage. Soviet prosecutors attempted to raise the atrocities during the Tokyo war crimes trials, but the Western Allies dismissed the evidence as propaganda. Entire testimonies vanished into classified vaults, replaced by carefully curated narratives of Japan's defeat. The physical remnants of Unit 731's work were equally chilling. Excavations near Harbin in the 1980s uncovered mass graves containing bones marked with surgical cuts and drill marks. Researchers found evidence of amputations performed without anesthesia, skulls opened while the victims were alive, and remains infected with various diseases. These findings confirmed what the secret transcripts had long detailed. Yet even after physical evidence surfaced, Western governments remained cautious, refusing to fully acknowledge the scope of their earlier collaboration. The truth was buried under decades of denial, silence, and diplomatic discomfort. Testimonies from Chinese survivors describe scenes of horror consistent with the files. In villages near Pingfang, black ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas were dropped from Japanese planes. Within days, entire communities were consumed by fever. Survivors recall corpses rotting in the streets, bodies bloated and covered in sores. One villager, interviewed in 1946, said, "The soldiers came not with bullets, but with sickness. Death entered our homes without sound." His testimony, preserved in Chinese archives, was dismissed in Western circles for decades. The reason was not lack of evidence. It was the political cost of admitting complicity. The disturbing silence extended well beyond the 1940s. In the 1950s and 1960s, as Cold War tensions deepened, fragments of Unit 731's research resurfaced in American and Soviet laboratories. Files marked bioweapons research, classified, described the testing of delivery systems for anthrax and plague, citing Japanese field data as a foundation. The euphemism concealed the reality. Those field data were the deaths of thousands. By then, the names of the victims had been erased, their identities reduced to subject groups. The transformation of atrocity into strategic asset was complete. Even within Japan, silence prevailed. Survivors of Unit 731's atrocities were ignored or dismissed as fabricators. Japanese school textbooks avoided mention of the program until the late 20th century. Shiro Ishii's name was absent from most official histories, replaced with narratives of national suffering under atomic bombs. The truth remained confined to the shadows, whispered only by survivors, and preserved in secret archives across Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. Today, the declassified files remind us of the silence that once protected these crimes. They reveal how atrocities can be hidden not just by perpetrators, but by victors who decide that justice is less valuable than knowledge. The disturbing silence of Unit 731 is not simply the silence of Japan, it is the silence of every power that chose to benefit from its horrors. The files are a grim testimony that war crimes do not always end in punishment. Sometimes they end in contracts, immunity, and whispered handshakes in dimly lit rooms. The shadows of Unit 731 still stretch across history. For every chart, every diagram, every page of experimental results, there is a life that ended in agony. And yet, those pages became part of military archives, used to design weapons, strategies, and survival manuals. The silence was deliberate. It was not ignorance, it was policy. And in that silence lies one of the darkest betrayals of the Second World War. Chapter 4. Hidden Carnage of Operation Keelhaul. In 1945, Europe was drowning in refugees. Millions of displaced persons wandered roads lined with rubble, carrying bundles of possessions, searching for homes that no longer existed. Among them were Cossacks, Ukrainians, White Russian émigrés, and anti-Soviet fighters who had fled Stalin's purges long before the German invasion. Many had fought alongside German divisions not out of loyalty to Hitler, but out of hatred for the Soviet regime that had starved, imprisoned, or executed their families. As the war ended, they believed they would find safety under the protection of the Western Allies. Instead, a secret operation consigned them to betrayal. Classified Allied files, stamped top secret, and later declassified under the name Operation Keelhaul, reveal the disturbing reality. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children were forcibly repatriated to the Soviet Union, handed over directly to Stalin's secret police, the NKVD. It was not liberation, it was a death sentence. The operation's origins lay in the Yalta Conference of February 1945. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin signed agreements that all Soviet citizens found in Allied zones would be returned to the USSR. The language was diplomatic, but its implications were devastating. For Stalin, repatriation meant mass executions, deportations to Siberian camps, and forced labor under conditions designed to erase political opponents. For the Allies, compliance meant maintaining fragile unity with Moscow, which was essential to secure Soviet cooperation against Japan. Thus, in quiet meeting rooms far removed from refugee camps, a decision was made. Human lives would be sacrificed for the sake of alliance. The files detail how the operation unfolded. In Austria and northern Italy, British troops surrounded Cossack camps, assuring families they would be relocated to safer zones. Instead, columns of soldiers forced them onto trucks and trains bound for the east. Reports from May 1945 describe Cossack officers invited to a conference with Allied generals near Lienz. Expecting discussions of their future, they were instead disarmed, bound, and delivered to Soviet authorities. Many never reached Soviet soil alive. NKVD officers executed officers on the spot, their bodies discarded in ditches. Those who did survive the journey faced decades in gulags, their children separated, their names erased. Eyewitness reports from Allied soldiers who participated in Keelhaul are preserved in military archives. One British officer, horrified by the task, wrote, "We handed them over knowing their fate. Women screamed, children clung to their fathers. Some threw themselves into rivers rather than board the trains." American accounts describe similar scenes. A US Army chaplain stationed in Bavaria recalled seeing a family of 5 hang themselves in their barracks upon learning they would be returned to the USSR. His report, filed under confidential for command only, was buried for decades. The statistics remain haunting. Historians estimate that between 2 and 3 million people were forcibly repatriated under Allied supervision between 1945 and 1947. Entire divisions of the Russian Liberation Army, who had fought against Stalin under General Andrei Vlasov, were shipped east in sealed trains. Many were executed within days of arrival. Others disappeared into the vast expanse of Siberia, where frozen camps consumed them without record. Children born in refugee camps vanished into orphanages, renamed and assimilated, their identities forever erased. Operation Keelhaul was not merely a logistical maneuver. It was the systematic erasure of entire communities. The betrayal extended beyond those deemed Soviet citizens. Among the victims were émigrés who had fled Russia decades earlier, some of whom had never held Soviet citizenship. White Russians who had escaped the revolution of 1917 found themselves branded as traitors and delivered into Stalin's hands. In one documented case, British officers forcibly handed over elderly priests from a Cossack church community in Austria. They were beaten by NKVD guards and dragged into waiting trucks. Their parishioners, left behind, watched in silence, powerless against the weight of Allied orders. The secrecy surrounding Operation Keelhaul was deliberate. Publicly, Western leaders spoke of liberty, justice, and the rebuilding of Europe. Privately, cables and memoranda stressed the need to suppress details of the repatriations. A British Foreign Office note dated June 1945 states, "Exposure of details would risk damage to public morale and relations with the Soviet Union. Silence is imperative." Thus, the victims vanished from newspapers and official histories, their voices smothered by the larger narrative of victory. Even within Allied ranks, dissent was silenced. Soldiers who protested the morality of the operation were reminded of their duty and threatened with court-martial. In one documented case, a British major who refused to oversee a transfer in Austria was relieved of his command. His personal letters, later uncovered, describe nightmares of screaming children torn from their mothers and loaded like cattle. He ended his letter with the haunting line, "We liberated Europe, but betrayed its soul." The NKVD's treatment of the returned refugees is detailed in Soviet archives captured after the Cold War. Execution orders list thousands of names, each marked with a simple notation, "Liquidated." Others were assigned to Gulag transports, their fates recorded only in numbers. A smuggled NKVD report from 1946 described the arrival of one transport train from Austria. Of 1,500 delivered, 220 executed immediately, remainder dispersed to camps. To the Soviet system, these people were not refugees. They were traitors to be erased. Operation Keelhaul lasted until 1947, long after the guns of World War II had fallen silent. Even as Europe rebuilt, the trains continued to roll eastward, filled with the condemned. The betrayal outlived the war, carried out under the cloak of peace. Only decades later, as archives were opened and survivors spoke, did the scale of the operation emerge. By then, most victims were long dead, their graves unmarked, their stories almost forgotten. The haunting truth of Operation Keelhaul is that it was not the act of enemies, but of supposed liberators. The Allies, who claimed to fight for freedom, became instruments of repression, delivering men, women, and children to their deaths in the name of diplomacy. The operation's hidden carnage was buried under the triumph of victory, sealed in classified files marked "Not for Release." When those files were finally opened, they revealed a moral wound that victory could never erase. The refugees who trusted in Western promises were betrayed not by their enemies, but by the very hands that had promised them safety. And their silence remains one of the most disturbing legacies of the war that was supposed to end all wars. Chapter 5. erase testimonies of the Katyn massacre. In the forests near Smolensk, beneath layers of pine needles and damp earth, lies one of the darkest graves of the Second World War. The Katyn massacre was not the chaos of battle, nor the heat of combat. It was a calculated execution, ordered by the Soviet NKVD in the spring of 1940. More than 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, priests and civil servants were rounded up, transported in sealed trains, and shot in the back of the head one by one. Their bodies were buried in mass graves, the soil carefully leveled to conceal the crime. For years, the truth was buried not only in the forest, but in the pages of international diplomacy. When Nazi forces uncovered the graves in 1943, they announced Soviet guilt, hoping to divide the Allies. But in London and Washington, leaders received intelligence that confirmed the German accusation. Instead of revealing the truth, they silenced it. The testimonies of the victims were erased, not by their killers alone, but by those who had pledged to fight for justice. The files hidden within US and British archives reveal this disturbing silence. A declassified cable from the Polish underground, sent in late 1943, described eyewitnesses who had seen NKVD trucks near the forests of Katyn. Names, dates, and even burial sites were provided. The report reached the Polish government in exile in London, which forwarded it to both Churchill and Roosevelt. Intercepted German communications, decrypted by the British at Bletchley Park, also indicated Soviet involvement. Yet, when the information crossed the desks of Allied leaders, it was marked politically inadmissible. In other words, it could not be acknowledged without jeopardizing the alliance with Stalin, whose armies were essential in the ongoing fight against Hitler. The truth became another casualty of strategy. Churchill's private notes reveal the cold calculation. In a memorandum dated April 1943, he wrote, "We must resist dwelling upon this tragedy. The issue is closed." Roosevelt too chose silence. American envoys urged restraint, warning that confrontation over Katyn would destabilize military cooperation. Thus, when the massacre was raised in public forums, Allied leaders echoed Moscow's narrative that the Germans were responsible. The lie was repeated, not because it was believed, but because it was convenient. The victims' voices were smothered under the weight of wartime necessity. The Nuremberg trials of 1945 offered a chance to expose the crime, yet even there, silence prevailed. Soviet prosecutors attempted to charge the Germans with the Katyn killings, presenting falsified documents and coerced testimonies. The Western Allies knew the accusation was false, yet they remained quiet, unwilling to humiliate their wartime partner. The result was a grotesque inversion of justice. The true perpetrators sat among the victors, accusing their enemies of their own crimes. Entire files documenting Allied knowledge of Soviet guilt were sealed, stamped not for release, and buried deep within government archives. The families of the murdered officers who demanded answers received only official denials. The massacre itself was meticulously organized. NKVD executioners transported Polish officers from camps in Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov, moving them to execution sites like Katyn Forest, Kalinin, and Kharkiv. Victims were bound, gagged, and lined up before pits. A single pistol shot ended each life. Soviet records declassified decades later describe the process with chilling efficiency. Over 300 executed daily. Disposal efficient. The scale of the operation left entire Polish communities leaderless. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, military officers, the intellectual backbone of Poland, were erased in a matter of weeks. It was not only murder, it was the decapitation of a nation. For the survivors, the silence was nearly as cruel as the crime itself. Families of the missing clung to hope, sending letters that returned unanswered. Some whispered that their husbands and fathers were alive in Siberia. Others suspected the truth but were told by Allied officials to remain patient. When the Germans exposed the graves in 1943, many Poles believed at last that their suspicions were confirmed. Yet when their own supposed allies denounced the evidence as propaganda, despair set in. They realized the world had chosen to erase them along with the dead. After the war, Polish émigrés continued to campaign for recognition of Katyn, but their efforts were suppressed. In communist Poland, the massacre could not be spoken of. Those who dared to mention Soviet guilt were imprisoned. In the West, the truth remained classified, hidden under layers of Cold War strategy. Congressional hearings in the United States during the 1950s briefly reopened the question, but official acknowledgement was withheld. It was not until 1990, half a century after the executions, that Moscow finally admitted responsibility. By then, most survivors had gone to their graves, never hearing the confession they had long awaited. The declassified testimonies found in Allied archives tell a story not just of murder, but of betrayal. They reveal that leaders who spoke of liberty and justice knowingly concealed evidence of atrocity. The silence was not accidental. It was deliberate, calculated to maintain alliances and protect diplomatic goals. The erased testimonies of Katyn remind us that truth itself can be a casualty of war, buried as deeply as the bodies in the forest. Today, visitors walk through Katyn's memorial grounds, where crosses and plaques mark the graves once hidden beneath pine trees. Yet even as the soil tells the truth, the documents remind us of the decades when silence reigned. The massacre was not forgotten because it was unknown. It was forgotten because it was forbidden. For 50 years, the voices of 22,000 dead officers lay beneath both earth and lies. Their testimonies were erased, first by bullets, then by politics. And when the files were finally opened, they revealed not only the cruelty of the NKVD, but the complicity of those who chose to look away. The files have been opened, but the silence remains deafening. Under the title 5, Disturbingly Forbidden, WWII reports that expose dark secrets. We have walked through archives that were never meant to see the light. Each chapter has shown that history is not merely what is remembered. It is also what is erased, suppressed, or buried under the weight of politics and power. Dachau's freezing experiments were not discarded as atrocity, but quietly folded into medical research. The Black Reichsbank ensured that Nazi fortunes survived defeat, feeding post-war corporations and networks of escape. Unit 731's unspeakable horrors were shielded by immunity, traded for data that shaped Cold War biological warfare. Operation Keelhaul betrayed thousands of refugees into Stalin's hands, proving that victory did not always mean liberation. And at Katyn, the murder of Poland's elite was not only denied by its perpetrators, but erased by supposed allies who feared the cost of truth. These revelations do not close the book on World War II. They pry it open, exposing scars that still run beneath the surface of modern history. If these 5 reports survived, what else remains sealed in vaults, buried in archives, classified beyond our reach? And the most haunting question of all, if these truths were hidden for decades, how many others will never be known?